invite whoever wants to join this discussion for the next few months on the policy issues of inequality to join us, and we will have in-between sessions. That's the spirit of this project anyway, that we want to broaden the discussion and bring in steering groups and so on, all intelligence we have on inequality, because it's very much needed to better understand inequality. And this leads to our next session that we are about to start. And I see that Thomas is already online and hopefully listening. We have one of the most prominent economists in the world having started to explore this inequality question, which has been a little bit in the darkness for some time, for a long time, because statistics weren't there and so on. So Thomas is certainly the one of the most important contributors to this puzzle, and to not to the puzzle, but to solve the puzzle and to better understand what is inequality and what are the numbers and so on. And Thomas has written the second book last year, and this has been published this year in German, which is called Capital or Kapital und Ideologie, Capital and Ideology. We today won't listen so much to your insights in inequality, but more on the ideology side. As you all have followed in the last year, this year, there's been a lot of confusion about German policy, and we're talking about the German model. And in a sense, in international terms, I think it must have been quite confusing for people to follow what has happened in Germany, because on the one side, we had this constitutional court decision, which has been, let's say, very orthodox and very against any broader understanding of European policies. And then suddenly a German government that has agreed on something which many people wouldn't have expected before, which is the recovery fund in Europe. So it seems as if, well, it's confusing, but maybe it's moving. And that's what we want to discuss. And it's the topic of your keynote, Thomas, to talk about what you think is your perception from Paris and from your view on, let's say, capital and ideology. What's the German ideology in the context of the European project and European renovation? So I want to hand over and thank you very much to have some time with us and give us a keynote on this very important issue that, by the way, we will continue to discuss during the day. And then we will have two commentators afterwards that I will present then. So Thomas, please start and give us your keynote.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for inviting me, and thanks a lot for this introduction. So as you know, as you said, you know, this, you know, we often see, you know, confusing you know, ideologies coming from a single country, because I think, you know, every country is much more complicated than what it is sometimes thought and you know, and described from the outside. So you know, I will not talk much about the Constitutional Court decision in this keynote, but let me say this. You know, I'm going to say, you know, I'm going to try you know, in this keynote, you know, to give a sort of very optimistic and positive view about the possibility of a renovation of Europe. And you know, I think this is the right time, and I think it is possible. And in particular, I would like to speak against you know, the pessimistic view according to which the differences between Germany and France and Spain and Italy in basic economic ideology, economic beliefs, economic culture makes it impossible to renovate Europe. You know, I want to speak against this idea because, in fact, there is no such thing as a German ideology or French ideology. And if you take, well, you know, first, I would like to make 2 points. First, if you take an historical perspective, you see actually a lot of imagination in German views about the economy, and a lot of innovation, in a way more innovation than in a country like France. So this will be my first point, is that there's a lot more imagination and pragmatism about economic belief in Germany and what we sometimes want to describe Germany as always very conservative, etc. But in fact, France has been, in many ways, has been more conservative historically. And my second point is that, well, if we want to address future challenge, we will have to be also very imaginative and innovative, in particular regarding the organization of federalism and in particular economic federalism and fiscal federalism in Europe. So first, let me start with my first point. If we take a long-run view on German economic ideologies and policies, what we find in practice is a lot of that. Many innovations, came from Germany. So after World War II, there was a huge public debt pretty much everywhere, and in fact, Germany, together with Japan, was one of the countries which used a lot at the time exceptional progressive wealth tax on very high wealth holders. So this was not only to solve the public debt problem, of course, this was also to solve for all the problem of people who had refugees coming from former eastern part of Germany. So it was a time of huge crises and huge inequity, and we countries had to find solution. But there was also an enormous public debt, and it was important to find new fiscal resources in order to address this. And the way the German government of the time designed a very progressive wealth tax with very, very high tax rate on top capital holdings, is very, very interesting, because there are some other countries, including France, which also used exceptional wealth tax a little bit, but much less so, and relied a lot more on more traditional policies like inflation, which of course, will hurt the poor and the middle much more than the progressive wealth tax that was used in Germany. So this innovation that came from Germany at the time is also due to the fact that there was a trauma with inflation in the 1920s, which contributed to make the German government more imaginative after World War II. But in any case, that's wealth tax, exceptional wealth tax to reduce large public debt is very much a German idea historically, and has been used a lot in Germany. Just to take another example on the ideology of how you regulate property relation in general, the co-determination laws that were applied and adopted in Germany in the 1950s were certainly very innovative for the time, with up to 50% of voting rights in corporate boards in large industrial companies. I can tell you, in France today, people are saying, oh, maybe we should do the same. That will be very good, I think, but this will actually require to change the French constitution, because the way the French constitution describes private property is, in a way, much more conservative and belongs to, if you want, 19th century proprietarian ideology, to describe using the terms that I use in my book. Whereas in Germany, the 1949 constitution refers to property as a social relation, involving different stakeholders, and in many ways, it's a much more sort of modern and much less conservative approach to property relation in general. So just with these two examples, which are quite important, both of them, I want to illustrate how if we take a long-run historical perspective, a lot of innovation in economic doctrine and in economic ideology, broadly speaking, has come from Germany. So the view that we have sometimes today that, German economists are always conservative, Germany as a country is very conservative and economic issues, and therefore no agreement is possible with much more imaginative countries like France or Italy or Spain. I think this is all sort of nationalist and counter-nationalist discourse, which do not pay a proper tribute to the complexity of each country, and in particular to the fact that, confronted with huge challenges, German political parties and trade unions and German society in general invented very impressive new solution to address enormous challenges. And I think, there are lessons to be drawn for the future. So now, looking at the future, what I want to stress is that we need to keep being imaginative, and in particular, I think we cannot take, the current organization of federalism in general in Europe and fiscal federalism in particular as given, and I think we will have to change the basic functioning on how we take decision, in particular on public debt and common budget and common taxation in the future. So just to summarize, what has happened this summer with the decision to have a new common public debt in order to confront the COVID crisis, and in particular, the most innovative component is of course the new common European public debt of 390 billion euros that is supposed to finance directly country budget, and then which is repaid together at the level of the European Union rather than to be repaid separately by the countries that benefit from this. So this is of course a major innovation which nobody before the COVID crisis was thinking to be possible. Now, I think unfortunately, there are two limits to this. The first limit is at 390 billion euro. This is a lot of money, but at the same time, the GDP of the European Union is more than 40,000 billion euro. So this is less than 3% of European Union GDP. This is going to be spent over 3, 4, 5 years. Well, as you know, this is not adopted yet, but this is supposed to be spent over 3, 4, 5 years. So this is like a bit more than 0.5% of GDP per year. So starting from a European Union budget of 1% of GDP per year, this is indeed a big increase. But if we take a broader historical perspective, this is not so huge, as compared to the size of country budget, as compared to the size of, if we compare the federal budget in the US, which used to be about 2% of GDP until the 1920s and jumped to 10–15% of GDP during the crisis of the 1930s. So if we make this kind of comparison, it is still relatively small. And I'm concerned about the fact that if in 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, we want to increase the size of this, how are we going to do? Which brings me to the second limitation, important limitation of what has been done, which is the fact that we are still stick with unanimity rule. And so, there was a lot of pressure on the Netherlands and Sweden in order to avoid a veto from them and get unanimity decision making. But, I think at some point, the price to pay for this becomes enormous, and I think at some point, I think maybe it's preferable to move with a smaller group of countries, at least for a number of years, with a majority rule decision-making system, and then when the other countries want to join because they see that this is working well, they will join. But just continuing with this system with unanimity rule with all the countries, it puts really strong limits. And let me conclude by mentioning what I think could be part of a solution, and the fact that I want to refer to as all of you know, there was a new bilateral treaty between Germany and France that was adopted last year, which created a French-German parliamentary assembly made of members of the German Bundestag and the French Assemblée Nationale. The only problem with this assembly so far is that it has no real power. It's a purely consultative assembly. But I think this is an interesting model because I think first it could be open to other countries, in particular Italy, Spain, and other European Union countries that might want to join. And this kind of assembly, could be granted decision-making power, typically to adopt a recovery plan or to adopt a larger common public debt if necessary. And we are in a situation where each national parliament, in effect, has a veto power on any common decisions that we take on a common public debt. And we know that now this fall we're waiting for each national parliament to approve what was decided last July. I don't think this kind of decision-making system can be with us for very long. One possibility would be to give all power to the Council of Ministers or the final say to the European Parliament, or at least to the countries that want to move ahead in this direction. But then this will in effect cut the European level decision entirely from national parliaments, from the Bundestag, from the Assembly, which I think is not doable and is not desirable when it comes to decisions that have big consequences on national taxpayers. So I think the only way to move ahead is to put these national parliament members in front of each other in a new kind of parliamentary assembly that will have the legitimacy to have the public deliberation and the majority rule decision-making power for certain decisions for the future. So this is a major change in the way we think about federalism in Europe. I mean, some would say this is a return to the old parliamentary, European Parliament of the 1960s, 1970s. The big difference is that here it will be with major decision-making power about the common public debt, common budget, and recovery plan. So I think this has really nothing to do. And again, we need to think. I'm not saying this is the only solution. I think it's a very complicated problem. Nobody has the perfect solution, but we really need to keep thinking about how we are going to move, possibly with a smaller number of countries, because the price to pay for unanimity rule, I think is really getting enormous and may prove to put very strong limit on our ability to react to new economic and social and sanitary development in the months to come. So let's keep being innovative, imaginative, as Germany has been about issues of taxation, including wealth taxation, public debt, property relation, and federalism, of course, in the future. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you very much. The perception of Germany and German policies, and we will continue to discuss this certainly during the afternoon, but the European issues certainly are also one of the top issues. So I would like to hand over to two excellent commentators. And first, Moritz, you can take your seat, but we want to start with Veronika Grimm, who's from the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg, and since recently, this year, member of the Council of Experts, Economic Experts of the German government, so one of now the most prominent economists in Germany, and she will comment on your keynote. Please, Veronika.
Yeah, thank you very much for the very optimistic keynote, and thank you very much for the invitation to make a comment. I want to start a little bit with the question. We had a big crisis in Europe, and many say now that we can take this crisis also as a chance to further develop. At the first moment, this didn't seem to be the case, because the free movement of goods, services, and people is essential for the European single market. And at the beginning of the corona pandemic, 17 member states closed the border temporarily, restricted the trade of goods, and also the mobility of workers within Europe. So initially, we had the member states pursued a very national and isolated corona policy largely, but basically due to the strong international interdependence in Europe, it became quickly clear that Europe can only engage in meaningful crisis management with regard to supply chains if we work together. So if one looks at the picture, in particular in Germany, it's evident that 25% of the intermediate products is currently imported mostly from the EU. So these supply chains that are within the EU are very important, and economic difficulties in one country can affect others. And this clearly justified enhanced cooperation to enhance resiliences within Europe. And I also think we need an innovative perspective, and we need joint growth and joint endeavors in order to further develop the EU and start into the future. And I think the Recovery Fund is a big important signal in this direction. So it is now important to look how to go further. There are several challenges. So money should be spent fast, which might be challenging in one or the other country, and directed towards growth enhancing measures. For example, a European approach to climate protection and digitization, infrastructure, investment, health policy. This is certainly a good way to go, and the EU is the right level to agree on rules in this respect and to promote these issues further. And I think it is clear that now the EU also has taken an important coordinating role in case of crisis to ensure that trade routes are kept open, that goods and services, capital, technology can flow without a major barrier. And so this is a good direction in which we are heading. There are many reasons for enhanced European cooperation right now. And I will name a few. One is certainly the global challenges in environmental and climate policy. They can only be addressed jointly, and they come with real chances also for Europe's industry and for innovation and competitiveness in certain technology fields. A second issue would be the decreasing willingness of the US to provide global public goods, for example, such as security. A third aspect and a third reason for enhanced European cooperation is that China is growing in terms of economic and political strength. And there are the current trade conflicts that have been active before Corona, and that will certainly play a major role in the future. And then, of course, the challenges posed by migration. I think it is important to see that there are different perspectives on the European endeavor that clearly play together. So some see the EU clearly as a political project designed to bring the people of Europe together and to maintain peace on the continent. The EU can also be an actor that allows European states not to be ignored in a global context and to defend their interests together. And one further aspect might be that the EU is also an opportunity to set regulatory standards for as many people as possible, which might be very important, for example, in the current developments in climate protection policies. We will have many new technologies, and common standards and norms are very important for them to really build markets where these products can be sold effectively. Cohesion in Europe requires a common vision, but also a common path. And there's certainly a lot of things to be done, a lot of proposals in the room which way we should go. Of course, we have for a long time, also in the treaties, the principle of subsidiarity. So the transfer of tasks to the European level should take place when the transfer of competence results in efficiency or cost advantages. And as I made clear, there are many issues where there's a case for that. However, at the same time, we observe that there are very heterogeneous preferences of the member states, which community tasks these are and which must be reconciled. And cohesion within the European Union, of course, also hinges on the support within the population of each and every country. So this is certainly an issue that we have to take seriously. In some areas, and there I am very much with Thomas Piketty, a coalition of the willing might be a way to go. This could be, for example, the case in issues of climate protection frameworks, where certainly member states can go together and push forward things, and others join in. Developments so far suggest that the tighter regulation of the banking sector has largely proven its worth. There is some room for improvement, which has to be discussed, and also there will be a discussion on fiscal rules and the sustainability of the member states' public finances. So maybe I stop here and give over to Moritz, who is in Berlin, as I see, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Does this work? Yeah, perfect. Well, thanks a lot for having me. Thanks, Thomas. Thanks for Veronika for the nice words and the fantastic keynote. I want to talk about two things, and I want to be reasonably brief, but also reasonably sort of provocative. So the first is, Thomas mentioned it at the very beginning. There is this old idea that economic philosophy in France and Germany couldn't be more different. The French like discretion, the German like rules, the French like solidarity, the Germans like liability. And that, I think both of those views have a lot of, if you look at economic history, but if you look at sort of macro economics more general, there's a lot of justification for both of them. I think we have learned, Thomas and I, we had this discussion a few times. We've all learned that maybe in 1929, 1930 in Germany with a more active fiscal policy, very bad things could have been prevented. But we also know from long run studies of economic history that in the long run, it's really important to get the institutions right. And if you don't get the institutions right, you end up in kleptocratic, plutocratic, unstable societies. So both the emphasis on rules, institutions, that is the German view, but also the emphasis on flexibility, on short-term crisis management, that is the maybe a little bit more the French tradition, or at least in current decades. If you go back in history, it was often the French who were very attached to the gold standard and were very laissez-faire, and the Germans more interventionist. But anyway, so I think that is number one. Number two is this idea about solidarity and liability within Europe. And again, you know, I think there are good points to be had. I mean, we want people to be liable, generally speaking, and even also the public sector for actions. And I think Veronika mentioned the subsidiarity principle. There's a lot to be said for having the spending and liability, or reward and liability being tightly linked. On the other hand, we also have seen it in Corona, and that's my first sort of provocative point, if you will, that solidarity per se is extremely important to keep the European project not only economically together, but also politically together. So my first point for the discussion would be, I really think that with the Corona COVID crisis, these two old distinctions, discretion versus rules and liability versus solidarity, have become a little bit obsolete, in the sense that I see in the German debate a very clear understanding, also driven by the success of the crisis management of our government, that a lot of porcelain can be broken in crises, and you need to be flexible and react, and sometimes you really need the bazooka to catch the animal spirits. And on the other hand, the nature of this crisis, and maybe 2008-9 was different, or at least could be spun in a different way, is one where, you know, liability is not what we like. No one is kind of responsible for a global pandemic. It's not to do with previous sort of bad behavior. There's no moral hazard issues. We really don't want this. And so on both of these margins, if you will, I think the Corona COVID crisis has opened a big room for us to go ahead. And I think the European solidarity you know, but the fund that we've established, you know, it's imperfect in many ways, and it risks being watered down by bureaucrats in Brussels and country allocations. And I think they've done a job already that probably, you know, this could have been managed much better on the PR side as really a big European solidarity project, and instead it's been sort of dragged down into country haggling over pork barrel, who gets how much. But on both fronts, I think Corona has opened up a new field for European action that the doors are open and we have to go through them. That's number one. Number two, and I would be super interested to also hear what Thomas has to say about this. My view for a long time, for quite some time now, was that to use that football analogy, you have this amazing team, Thomas, so like football analogy works really well. I think the ball is in your camp. I think the ball is in the French camp, because I think what's holding, I don't think on the German side, if you make the marriage proposal, I don't think the Germans wouldn't say yes. But for now, I think the impression in Berlin is that, you know, to use that Brexit word, that in a way France wants to have its cake and eat it, in the sense that the nation state, France is much more attached to that. Germany has a long tradition of being, you know, this subsidiary, complicated federal setup with lots of, you know, it's been a nation state only for 120 years or 150 years now. So I think Germany would be open to that federal Europe, but in a way the marriage proposal has to come from France. And my perception is that the French elite and the French state, being so entrenched to the nation state, actually has a much higher hurdle to jump than the German political system would have to go that next step towards a federal Europe. Maybe I'll leave it here.
Thank you very much, Moritz. As I didn't want to touch the micro, I didn't introduce you, but all of you know Moritz as a professor at the University of Bonn and working for INET. Thomas, there have been some question directly to you.
Yes, so regarding the marriage proposal coming from France, you know, I'd be happy, Moritz, to make you a marriage proposal, and we can discuss two of us. Let me, you know, I think the French, you're right about the fact that you're probably right about the fact that it has to come a lot from France, and that there is some resistance in France about the national sovereignty and the nation state, especially, you know, when it comes to regalian issues and, you know, diplomacy, military issues. So if you want to transfer directly diplomacy, military issues to the European to a European Assembly, you know, maybe that's not the best way to go. But if we talk about budgetary issues and you know, recovery plan and a common tax on the profits of large corporations, and, you know, more fiscal justice, etc. You know, I think the French elite, or at least, you know, certainly the French public opinion is ready, you know, well ready to understand that it will be better to have, you know, take the French-German Parliamentary Assembly that was created last year. I think if we were to decide to transfer, to decide that just France and Germany have a common corporate tax, at least on corporations above a certain size, and that this assembly, this common parliamentary assembly, will be in charge of adopting both a common corporate tax base and a minimum corporate tax rate to be applied together. You know, I don't think there will be a strong resistance in France for that. And so if you tell me that, if I understood you well, that this kind of marriage proposal will be well received in Germany as well, then you know, let's go. So you know, I want to make sure that this is what you had in mind. You know, I think the complication, both from the German side and the French side, to be, you know, more precise, will come from the fact that you know, initially some countries will probably not enter into that kind of scheme. And so many people will say, oh, we are splitting Europe again, this is not the time to do that. And that will be a difficult decision, I think, both in Germany and France. But, you know, tell me if I am wrong, you know, because, you know, there are some countries that would not want to have a majority rule decision making about the corporate tax or about the recovery plan, and you know, you know, maybe it would have been better, to have a clear veto in July, or maybe there will be a clear veto in the, I think one reason why there was the veto power was not exerted until the end by the Nordic countries is also probably because they know that if they exert it, then this will trigger a reaction with this kind of smaller circle political integration that we are talking about. But yeah, I'd be curious to know, the two of you, whether you really think that this kind of marriage proposal that I was describing with a majority rule decision making in a common parliamentary assembly based on national parliament members would be so welcome in German circles.
Any reaction to what Veronika said? I think there was no direct question, so my...
Well, maybe, no, one point about what Veronika said, I think we have to be very careful indeed about the fact that, there are many segments of the public opinion in different ways, in different countries, are very skeptical about Europe and are very careful. But I think, one important point, when I look at who is more against Europe, in across European countries, or if I look at referendum over Brexit or the referendums that happened in France in 2005 or 1992, it's always the bottom income groups and, the bottom 50% income groups and education groups and wealth groups that are the most negative against Europe integration. And I think this has to do with the fact that so far, we've never really used Europe as a tool for more economic justice, and in order, in particular, to ask more to the biggest winners of globalization. And that's why I think it is so important, to have some common solidarity that's based not only on public debt, but also at some point on, taxing the biggest winners of globalization together. And I think this is the only way. It will take a long time in any case, but this is the only way to try to restore a little bit of trust in Europe, especially among the most disadvantaged socio-economic groups.
Moritz, on the marriage proposal, who's come back?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the German political system would have it would be a major challenge it would be a major challenge to say no. I think there's always been an idea in European integration and German political history after World War II that this is a way to potentially overcome an unloved and, catastrophic experience with the nation state and nationalism. And it might be, the historical moment might be there where the country in that moment now where we are also sort of, I think geopolitically we're going like very far now, but where we're torn between, where we sort of entering a new setup between potentially, not very peaceful, or peaceful, yes, but maybe not very coexisting, peacefully coexisting big geopolitical blocks where Europe has to take that step. I think my impression from discussions also, if you think about the Constitutional Court judgment, if you think about the criticism of German more conservative economists of the euro and the European project, it's always been that idea that somehow France is trying to leverage the German balance sheet, but ultimately not let go of control over what France wants to do. So this old de Gaulle idea that, France uses European integration as a leverage to preserve French power, using sort of the economic might of the rest of Europe, but ultimately not being willing to give up control, is still very prominent. I see that. So, and if you look at the Constitutional Court judgment, and it's always clear that, like, as long as this sort of, on the basis of the German Constitution, we're thinking about this, but of course, if steps beyond that become possible and are taken, the jurisdiction of the German Constitutional Court does no longer apply. I think sort of in that German rule-based framework, that idea of like, okay, if we take the next step, then it has to be like a formal arrangement, and we at some point are at the end of this sort of piecemeal approach where, if you think about the Constitutional Court, where it's like, but okay, there's sort of, we push it a little bit, and then there is the pushback. in my view, that might create more conflict and more resentment. And I agree with you also on the social stratification of that resentment, than actually, as you propose, working on that big proposal and then, you know, ultimately have a referendum and see how far we want to go with a federal Europe.
Veronika, maybe just adding that you're a member of this council where 2 of the 5 members have advised the Constitutional Court, Lars Feld and Volker Wieland, maybe influencing this. Would you think that you get a majority on this marriage proposal in the council?
So we didn't discuss this yet. I think I also think there is currently an opportunity to further develop the European Union. I think there is an open door, but also I think that to get institutions right will matter a lot in Germany, also for political actors. And maybe I would see a chance to. I think it is very important to have this perspective in the participating countries within the population or within broad majority in the population, that the EU really contributes and opens up chances for the member states. And I think there's a big door open right now, and there will be quite some challenges. For example, due to the structural change that is now triggered by the corona crisis, there will be many structural changes also in the economy. Thinking, for example, about things that happen now to tourism in Southern Europe. So there will be quite some challenges that we have to tackle, and there are also within the recovery funds programs that can provide perspectives how to tackle these issues with investments that promote growth in the countries and that provide perspectives, employment, and so on. I am coming back to your question. I cannot judge whether we would agree in the council, but I think a common perspective among all of us is that due to the corona crisis and the action of also the German government and the French government, there are significant perspectives to really go through these open doors.
Thank you. Thomas, on the point of Moritz, on maybe you could answer on this supposed unwillingness of French elites to go further this way, maybe something.
Yeah, I think this is certainly part of the difficulties. At the same time, let me emphasize again that if you have a marriage contract where it's not only France and Germany which together have a common parliamentary decision-making process to have a common budget, a common tax, but it's also Italy, Spain. So if you take France, Germany, Italy, Spain, you have 75% of the population and the GDP of the Eurozone, which is already quite significant. Now, within these 4 group of countries, if you add a parliamentary assembly in proportion to the population of each of these 4 countries and in proportion to the current political groups in the different national parliaments, I think there will be a majority to vote a bigger recovery plan than what we voted together with unanimity in July, and that is not yet adopted. And I think there will be a majority to vote a change in the tax system, in particular for large corporations and possibly for high income and high wealth individuals. I don't know exactly what will be the majority, but I have the feeling, given the public opinion in Italy, Spain, France, Germany right now, that there will be possibly a majority to move in this direction. Now, who would be more upset about this? Would it be the French elite or some of the German elites? I don't know. I mean, I'd be curious to have your view, Moritz and Veronika, about this. I think, some of the German elite, or just some of the German public opinion in general, might be afraid to be put in a minority in such a decision-making process. Whereas with the current system, where each country, has in effect a veto power, and particularly the most powerful economic country, what is Germany, you can. In effect, you can, if the German government disagrees about anything, nothing will happen. Within this parliamentary system that I am describing, potentially, potentially, in effect, even if there's no majority support within the German Bundestag, there could be a majority support in this joint European Assembly, even though the assembly I am describing will be even if it was fully proportional to population, which is not the case with the European Parliament, but in the project I've been describing, it's fully proportional to population, or at least more proportional to population. In my view, it should be fully proportional. And still, in Germany, there could be a fear to be put in a minority. But so I'd be curious to have your view on this. I mean, if it is not the case, and if in the end the attachment to the European project and European federalism and rule-based and institution-based approach is stronger, this is good news. But I'd be curious to have your view on this.
Yeah, no, very, very good points. I think the one important point I wanted to make is I think there's a deep suspicion in the political sphere of proposals that pool resources without thinking about the institutions and getting the long-term institutions right. So that's why my point was, like, if there is a proposal on the table that, I mean, Veronika can chip in and jump in and tell us what she thinks as well. But if there was a constitutional proposal on the table, and these constitutional proposals, they have checks and balances, you would maybe have a parliament and a second chamber, and the second chamber could US style, Senate style, reserve some prerogatives, and it would be clear which powers are delegated to the union level and what remains national or even regional. I mean, we're getting into the details there, but I think if such a proposal was on the table and we would discuss, does the European Union have the competence for, value-added tax or income tax, then I think you would find a German, very law-based and legally focused public mindset be very engaging with that. And I think it would be, given the tradition of the Federal Republic, it would be just very hard if there's an honest proposal on the table from the French saying, okay, we go beyond l'État-nation and we start something new here, and this is for real. It would be very hard for the German political culture, tradition, and mindset to not say yes and engage with it. But
Veronika, any thoughts on that?
My suspicion is that in German politics, this institutional view would be very important. And it is of course also important what in how far proposals are really agreed upon in the population, not only in, I mean, it's of course a debate that also affects many other countries, and that also affects incentives that are implemented in other countries with respect to this new governance structure. I think that these issues, how much support and backup there is in the populations for that, does not only play a role within the member countries that are acting, but also in member countries that are not not immediately involved. This might make it different and more difficult. But I think, of course, if there is such an initiative by France, I think that German politics would react and would try to also put that further.
Thank you. Thomas, has this been satisfying?
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, this is very, you know, I wanted to be optimistic, and I thought, you know, the two reactions by Veronika and Moritz, you know, confirm in my view that we, you know, we have to be optimistic, we have to be ambitious. But now to conclude with something, you know, specific, you know, even more constructive and even more specific, you know, I think the question is, how do we move ahead with what an honest proposal, you know, to use the term used by Moritz, you know, would look like? And so, as you probably know, Moritz and Veronika, you know, we have put together a proposed, you know, treaty for the democratization of Europe and a manifesto for the democratization of Europe, which is available online. So let me do a little bit of advertisement, you know, tdem.eu, Treaty for Democratization of Europe. And I'd be curious to know, you know, Moritz and Veronika, you know, not now, but next time we discuss, or, you know, another time, you know, we can correspond by email, you know, how much of an honest proposal this is. And you know, I'm by the way, we are aware, you know, we have, you know, I mean, dozens of people have participated to this project, including many people from Germany. We have about 100,000 people who have signed this project across Europe, which is still small, but it's already something. And you know, we are all aware that maybe, you know, this is 5% of the solution or 3% of the solution in this proposal. You know, there's a lot to add. There's a lot. You know, Moritz was referring to the checks and balances and whatever. You know, there's a lot to change to this and to add to this proposal. But let's start from something and let's see, you know, what needs to be added. Let's see what's need to be, you know, we need to suppress. But you know, I think this is time to move. You know, we cannot just wait for a perfect, you know, French government that will arrive in the future and make a perfectly honest proposal, which Germany will not refuse. So I agree with the general premises that, you know, some of the blocking forces are in France and Germany, you know, probably will be ready to move ahead. But once we've said that, if we want to make progress in this direction, I think we all have to contribute in effect to what, you know, an honest marriage proposal would look like.
Okay, we have some minutes left. Maybe if there's someone in the audience who wants to ask a question, please raise your hand. I would just like to know, as we're now talking evidently and importantly about Germany, but as you said, I mean, there have been, finally Germany has joined the camp in a way, but now there are 4 to 5 countries, frugal countries who are not joining. What is your reading of that? I mean, is on talking about ideology, even social democrat governments have joined this opposition. What is your reading?
You know, first of all, I think we have to be very careful with the words we use. And in particular, the word frugal, you know, I think is really problematic. Especially when it comes to the Netherlands, I should say, and their tax dumping strategy regarding the corporate tax. You know, there is some very careful computation that has been made by Gabriel Zuckman, who's a professor of economics at Berkeley University, together with some colleagues from Copenhagen universities, and looking very, very precisely at the financial accounts of companies who have their headquarters in the Netherlands. You know, they have come to the conclusion that in effect, you know, the Netherlands, or, you know, the Netherlands government is taking, you know, around 10 billion euros per year in tax revenues away from other countries for economic activities that does not take place in the Netherlands. You know, these are just purely book profits. You know, these are not, there's no real economic activity of any kind. So now, when, and you know, this is very well evident. You know, there's a website called, you know, missingprofits.com, which you can go to. There's a lot of statistical material making this demonstration. Now, when you take 10 billion euros per year away from Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and your neighbor countries, and you present yourself as a frugal country, this is a very costly way to be frugal, and so I think the problem is that now we live in a world where everybody has this kind of information, and I remember some, some reaction in Italy, and very upset against this kind of rhetoric. So this is very, very, very dangerous, and this makes me, very, very upset for the next step. And I was a bit sad indeed to see, the Swedish Social Democrats siding with this kind of discourse. Yeah, this is a bit sad. I think this will change at some point. The Swedish Social Democrats have been very internationalist when it comes to refugees. Much more open than a country like France, for instance. Much more internationalist regarding global warming, including than France. But when it comes to common economic policy or tax policy in Europe, they've been very conservative historically. They feel, they can do it on their own way well, and they do many things very well on their own, of course. But I think at some point, we live in the same planet, we live in the same continent, we are not going to be able to have free trade and free capital flows without common taxation, common regulation, common carbon tax, common environmental policy forever. And I would like the Swedish and Nordic Social Democrats in general to participate more to this discussion. And I think at some point they will, but it's possible that first we need to go through an historical phase where we move ahead with a smaller number of countries. And I think as long as we have the core of the Eurozone is moving, I think it's worth going in this direction, always of course keeping it open for the other countries to join.
Thank you. Moritz or Veronika, any further comment? I would just mention that there was one very important question, which is not directly related. Maybe you have a very quick answer, which is on inheritance taxes, which we have mentioned, which may be part of the assembly of decision making. But in very general terms, the question is, why is it such a difficult thing to decide or to convince people? It's a very sensitive issue, inheritance taxes, but on the other side, it might be very effective in reducing inequality. That's a question by Martina Linatas from the audience from Zoom.
Yeah, I think annual wealth tax are generally better than inheritance tax. I think we need both. But the view that many economists have pushed in the past, that inheritance tax are better and we should just have a big inheritance tax, I think is wrong. Well, first, it's wrong in terms of theoretical understanding of the tax. I think the good thing about the annual wealth tax is that because it's a small tax every year, it can adapt to the change in the value of your assets. Whereas, inheritance tax, it's once and for all, but, look, if I inherited an apartment in Paris in the 1970s that was worth 100,000 euros at the time, nobody could guess at the time that it will be worth 5 million euros today and will bring me a rental income of, 10 times minimum wage or whatever. So that's why an annual tax, it can adapt to the changing asset values and economic value of what you own. And so I think it's generally better. And also, actually, in actual facts, it raises a lot more revenue. If we take a broad view of annual wealth tax, including, of course, property tax and real estate tax, the property tax in the United States, or the taxe foncière, which is the equivalent of the property tax in France, raises more than 2% of GDP right now. Inheritance tax is less than 0.5% of GDP. So I think there's more potential, an annual wealth tax, and it's always been a bigger source of fiscal revenue historically than inheritance tax, and so I think it's very important to change from this. I think for a long time it has been a dominant economic view among economists to favor the inheritance tax, but it's less popular in public opinion. And it's actually less efficient from an economic viewpoint than a wealth tax. The millionaire tax and billionaire tax is very popular, in most countries. The public opinion very well understand that if you own millions or billions, you should pay more tax on this basis of your wealth. The millionaires and billionaires don't like it, of course, but in public opinion, it's actually pretty popular, and I think we have to move in this direction.
Many thanks, Thomas. We have come to the end. We're 5 minutes to 11:30, and many thanks for joining us. And hopefully, at some point in the future, we will meet again in person. But so thanks, Moritz. Thanks, Veronika. We now will have a 15 minutes or approximately 15 minutes break here in the room, and at home, wherever you are in the office. We are about more than 200, I think, which is difficult to see because it's a lot of people online. But many thanks, so Thomas, and take care till next time. Thank you.
Okay.